We're back in benchmarks again, this time with the Noctua NH-U12S Redux. It's a sort of new version of the long-standing Noctua NH-U12S tower. It's a fairly slim tower. It suits a 120mm fan, as indicated by the name, and with the Redux version, the price has come down. Now, this cooler is sold for $50 in most places, whereas the original is closer to $60 or $70, commonly $70. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We've added a 65-watt heat load to the testing for this cooler. That includes some comparison to stock AMD Wraith coolers and also the Noctua NH-P1, which is passive because why not? That's kind of interesting. And we'll be able to tell you if it's worth moving over from both an acoustic and a thermal perspective. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So the Noctua NH-U12S Redux has a few changes from the original, but not too many. They look mostly the same from the outside. There's a few cosmetic changes, but primarily this is just a cheaper version of what has already existed with a different fan, the Redux line of fans instead. The Noctua NH-U12 series is targeted primarily at wide compatibility. And so in this review, we'll be looking at the thermals on 3 different types of heat loads. This will cover everything from an R5 or i5 non-K class of CPU in terms of power consumption, up to, of course, an R7, i7 type of CPU. And then we'll even stretch up to 200 watts, which is more of an overclocked heat load or an Intel K-SKU heat load once it's in at least tau and boosting within those first 56 seconds or so of turbo boost. So that's what we're covering. It's a whole lot. You'll have a great picture of how good or not good this cooler is based on the data we've collected, and hopefully make it clear whether it's worth going to, say, an $80 or $90 air cooler or a liquid cooler even, as opposed to this $50 one, and if this is worth an upgrade over one of the quote-unquote free included coolers that AMD has made over the years. So it's meant for wide compatibility with cases and motherboards. It's relatively small. The size of the mounting system is also a small footprint, so there's less risk of running into things like VRM components that are running close to the socket, and there aren't many changes versus the original or the NH-U12S SE AM4, which is the original with different mounting hardware, but there are a few. The biggest difference is that fan. It switches from the NF F12 120mm fan to the NF P12 Redux fan. That one has a wider RPM range. There's slight differences in the noise profile, but not much. Pricing, of course, also different. As mentioned, we're down to $50 on the Redux versus $70, and so that turns the Redux into a small tower that's targeted at the more, we'll use the word premium or perceived high-end range of coolers for a relatively cheap price class. As convoluted as that is, Noctua is trying to position itself still as the quality or the premium brand. However, it must compete obviously with a thin single tower versus the many coolers on the market that range from $8 to, say, $30 as more of a common price point for a competing cooler to this one. But there are trade-offs. Many of them have to do with the mounting hardware quality and the build quality of the product in general, not necessarily just the thermals. So another difference with the new one is mechanical. The Redux has a thicker nameplate on top. This seems mostly useless until you start looking at how our originals look. The thicker nameplate on the new one is secured with 4 screws to the top set of fins. This adds some extra strength where our originals needed it. It'll prevent cosmetic bends and dings in the fin stack. Those won't affect the performance, at least not in any measurable way, but it doesn't look great, and that'll help even the quality control and the damage out. The kit includes an L-shaped Phillips No. 2 screwdriver for the Redux, and accompanying that is a set of well-documented, clear instructions with pictures and clear language to make installation easy. Considering how annoying coolers have been in the past, we greatly appreciate and hold in high value the clearness of language and installation guides. This is one of the easiest 2-point mounting systems that we've worked with, so Noctua gets credit for that as well. As for the driven portion of the cooler body itself, that's female threaded. This made mounting slightly easier than male threads, and captive springs don't engage until after the threads have been fully engaged. This is another great attention to detail feature. It seems very obvious. That's how you should use springs in a mounting system, but if you've watched our videos, maybe you wouldn't be surprised that sometimes the springs don't really do what they're supposed to do. It's often overly easy to crumple them to the point where the springs do nothing, or the springs can provide too much resistance and make it difficult to securely mount the cooler to the CPU. Now this will change a little bit based on the CPU you're mounting it to, so it's not always clear if there's a problem, but we have certainly seen problems with spring tension in the past, which is unfortunate because the whole point of it is to prevent user error causing damage to things, and to make it really easy to gauge whether it's tight enough. This one makes it pretty easy, and it's designed well. Installation is straightforward. On AMD, the AM4 backplate is used, and 4 plastic gray standoffs are installed on top of the backplate threads. This is best done on a flat surface so that you can hold it all in place. Otherwise, it'll be frustrating if you're trying to install this cooler while the motherboard's already mounted in a case and standing up. So just do this before you install the board. The mounting brackets are next placed on top of the standoffs with a screw running through each and into the backplate. Noctua smartly warns against over-torque here because it'd be a potentially easy place to do it. With both brackets installed and with the deep part away from the socket, the 2 spring tension screws get tightened into the bracket, and that's it. It's done, it's installed. The Intel installation is familiar. An included backplate is first installed, and then you use 4 standoff screws that pass through the holes and 4 plastic standoffs that sit on top of those. This creates the appropriate Z-height spacing, at which point the 2 brackets are then installed with 4 cap screws to secure everything. And at that point, the cooler is installed the same way with the 2 screws that are spring tensioned. So this is an incredibly straightforward installation process. It's about as plain as you can get, and that's a good thing. Noctua hasn't done anything overly complex. It has basically repurposed its sort of older mounting solution and made it work here, so no problems there. Now that we've shown how the cooler mounts and installs, we can look at the pressure distribution across the surface of the integrated heat spreader. This doesn't show us the flatness of the surface, but rather the quality of the hardware and its ability to evenly spread the pressure. For this, we use specialized tools to create this pseudo-color pressure map, and a huge thanks to our supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/gamersnexus, and on the GN store for making it possible for us to afford this expensive equipment. On the 2 CPUs tested and across 4 passes, we observed roughly identical patterns. The Redux is what we're looking at now, and that one has pressure distribution centrally, and it's pretty good there where the dies are actually located, but it's lacking at the outer edges. On our 3950X IHS, 3 of the 4 corners have poor contact, and the left and right sides also show limited contact. The 3800X IHS shows poor contact, especially in the bottom left, except for along the IHS edge. And also on the left side, it's lacking. This could be improved with Noctua's mounting solution and will contribute to the ability to cool higher TDP dies. However, at lower power consumption, central contact is sufficient for good dissipation, and ultimately, thermal paste helps fill any gaps anyway. This is probably the weakest area so far that we've seen, and it's one of the key areas that Noctua could improve. For the original Noctua NH-U12S, not the Redux version, we observed better overall pressure distribution across the IHS. It was more consistent, and this is partly to do with unit-to-unit variants of mounting solutions, but consistency is an important factor in cooler design and in manufacturing. This one's weaknesses are on the left and right sides of the IHS, with the bottom oriented towards the RAM as a reminder, but it's overall more even than the Redux was. That doesn't mean it's a better cooler or a better mount, just that in this case, the pressure's more even and we need more data to extract meaning from that. We'll start with noise-normalized thermals, which equalizes the playing field and controls for one of the important variables. This allows coolers to run with their included fans, but configured to produce the same noise level as each other under level conditions. That means that we're disallowing the fan to brute force the cooling performance. We will look at that next though, so if a cooler just runs louder than everyone else, hopefully it'll end up at the top of the next chart. The 123 watt heat load starts us off here. This one would be similar to most post-Tau K-SKU Intel CPUs or AMD R7 CPUs. We'll get to the AMD stock cooler comparisons in a moment once we go to the 65 watt heat load test. The Noctua NH-U12S at 35 dBA ran at about 61 degrees Celsius over ambient here, with the NH-U12S Redux, the newer one, at 60.2 degrees over ambient. They're the same, in other words. This is within our error and our tolerances, so there isn't a huge difference thermally, if any at all. This puts them ahead of the Scythe Ninja, which was woefully ill-equipped when compared to the Fuma 2, and that's because of its obsession with silence to the point of damaging its performance. The Fuma 2 was good though, and we were happy to recommend it in its price class. The NH-U12 coolers are more efficient than the Arctic Freezer 50, which was poorly received in our review, and they also encroach on the Noctua NH-U14S, but they do allow it an advantage, partly thanks to its 140mm fan, which is able to move more air while still running at the same noise level for noise-normalized thermals. As a reminder, the 123-watt heat load critically does not produce enough heat to space out the high-end coolers meaningfully. Their value would be perceived as worse until you pair them with a more appropriately power-hungry CPU. It's definitely diminishing returns for something like a Liquid Freezer 2 when you're talking about a 123-watt heat load. This chart shows the same test, except with the fans at 100% speed. The Noctua NH-U12S ends up at 37.1 dBA here in a noise floor of 26 and measured at 20 inches distance fixed, and the NH-U12S Redux was about 40.2 dBA. So it's louder when at 100% speed, but it also runs about 200 RPM higher. So this difference does make sense. As a reminder as well, fans are typically, as industry standard, about plus or minus 10% on the RPM one to the next. So it is possible with that 10% difference on the two that you could end up with a Redux and a non-Redux that are actually about the same RPM. The Redux holds at 58 degrees to the non-Redux is at 59.5 degrees. Given the noise difference, these two remain similar overall, with a slight advantage to the Redux. They're both capable of maintaining a stable temperature on a similarly powered CPU, assuming a case that isn't overly restrictive. That means this cooler would be suitable for an AMD R7 CPU with, say, a 105-watt TDP, or an Intel i5 or i7 K-SKU or similar. However, note that the cooler will be unable to keep up with thermally dependent boosting like TVB, which requires a temperature below 70 degrees Celsius as a hard threshold, and it'll also struggle with Intel's 56-second tau boosting window. Also, as a reminder, the 105-watt TDP number does not mean the power consumption, but it maps out to be about what this cooler can handle. The noise-normalized 200-watt load was predictably too much for this cooler. You shouldn't be buying a 120mm small tower cooler like the NH-U12S if you want it to operate both quietly and at a capacity that allows a CPU with this power draw running. A sufficient fan can overcome some of the surface area limitations of a fin stack of this size, but the noise will obviously ramp aggressively in step to keep up. This one shows the 200-watt 3950X heat load while at 100% fan speed. The fans are at full blast here, so the NH-U12S Redux's result at 40 dBA was 62 degrees over ambient. It technically passed the test. It didn't die or crash. It's just below the Fuma 2, marking the NH-U12S Redux as reasonably efficient given the workload and the price. And it's cooler than the Ninja 5 as tested below. Larger air coolers like the Deepcool Assassin 3 produce upwards of an 8-degree difference, which is massive for an air cooler, and that's enough to actually make a significant difference in how you use the system. The NH-U12S Redux, although it didn't fail during this testing, was pretty close to a potential failure. Within a hot case, this would be a no-go, and we don't recommend it for 200-watt heat loads anyway, but it technically did pass, which is impressive. It just didn't pass by much. As goes the saying though, a D gets a degree, and in this case, it's a few degrees away from failure. Remember that ambient in our test is around 21 degrees, and so that's why once you start adding hotter cases, or maybe you're in a hotter environment without AC, we'd recommend just buying something bigger than this. Time for the 65-watt heat load. This is getting down to R5 class CPUs, so this is where these coolers really make sense. We didn't run both the NH-U12S coolers for this because we had already invested significant time in this piece and determined that they're roughly the same. The more important comparison is to the other coolers. As a reminder, this dataset is new for us, so it's relatively limited. We're adding to it over time, and it'll take a few months to build larger charts like the other ones. The test is representative of R5 or non-K i5 and i3 CPUs. Noise normalized at 35 dBA, the Noctua NH-U12S Redux managed the best thermals of the 4 total units we've tested in this config so far. It's at 39 degrees over ambient, and that's actually a great result. Compared to the Wraith coolers we've tested at the same noise level, it's improved by at least 9 degrees, or about 13 degrees versus the Spire that we tested. The Noctua passive cooler is also able to handle this heat load, although it runs predictably much warmer, but it makes zero noise, so there's a benefit. The Redux would be a good upgrade for those on stock coolers, which aren't particularly good. Additionally, the NH-U12S Redux could be even quieter than these while still running stable temperatures. For example, if you were okay with 48 degrees on your Prism before, you'd presumably also be okay with 48 degrees on your Redux. Except 48 degrees on your Redux would allow it to run with a much lower fan speed and therefore noise level, providing an acoustic benefit. At 100% fan speed, the Noctua Redux runs only marginally cooler, now at 38 degrees over ambient, versus its 35 dBA result, that is. This is partly because the heat load is so low that we're at diminishing returns for higher end coolers versus the CPU. The Wraith coolers ascend the charts, now at 43 and 51, but they still can't catch up with the Redux. That's in spite of them running at 47 dBA and 40 dBA, while the Redux is just 40 dBA. The Redux offers better cooling even at significantly quieter noise levels than these stock coolers, and it would be a good upgrade path. Concluding then, at $50, it is definitely a far better deal than it used to be when it was 60, 70 or so for the original NH-U12 over on this side of the table. So that's a good thing. It's still relatively expensive, is maybe not the right word, because there are justifiable reasons for the price on this cooler, mostly relating to build quality, mount quality, ease of installation, and support. You look at Noctua's recent actions, for example, where the company said if you have one of its existing coolers, all you have to do is email them to get the LGA 1700 mounting hardware that'll be needed for Intel's new CPUs coming out in Alder Lake. So that's very valuable, obviously, because it means if you spend the $50 or the $70 or whatever now, hopefully, if Noctua keeps using that policy, in the future as new sockets come out, the goal would be that Noctua just ships you another set of brackets as soon as you need support for a socket which is not supported by the original kit you got. So that has value. It's difficult for us to review what Noctua is going to do in the future and how well they're going to support that, but if the past is an indicator, and it often is, it seems like Noctua is trying to do the right thing. In fact, the company recently said that it's providing the LGA 1700 kit upon request, and proof that you have one of these, although you can buy the mounting kit for about $8 as well. It said it's doing that partly because why create more waste? And that's a fantastic outlook on manufacturing something like a cooler anyway, because this doesn't really go bad. Copper, aluminum, nickel-plated, just all metal components, it's not like they spoil. And so as long as it can be adapted forward, you can keep using the product. Kind of like a good case or a good power supply, as long as the standards don't change. And so the reason we're mentioning this stuff today is because based on Noctua's recent statements of free or cheap mounting hardware for existing products, some of the cost becomes justified because you buy it and then you can keep using it. You don't have to spend the $50 again. It's kind of like when you buy a tool cheap, you have to buy it twice. You buy a $25 tower cooler, you might have to buy it 2 or 3 times as the sockets change, depending on how well that's supported and if the company kills that line over time. So there's value there. That said, if all you want is a cheap tower cooler, this is on the higher side. We think it's justifiable at $50 anyway. Certainly not 70. That's far too high for what this is. But 50 is justifiable. But you can get cheaper at $30, $25, pretty common price points. We're going to look at those too. We have reviews coming up of coolers in those price categories. So if all you care about is cheap performance, then keep an eye out. We'll have reviews of it. This probably isn't it. It's not necessarily cheap, but it is performance. Acoustically, this does all right. When you noise normalize all the coolers at the same level, looking at a 65 watt heat load against the AMD stock coolers, this is a massive upgrade, as would be any tower cooler of this nature. Noctua is not magic, as a reminder. They do good things in general, but they are certainly not breaking the laws of thermodynamics or physics. So not magic, but far better than the AMD stock coolers. It's a good upgrade path if you want to get off of one of those. And the biggest thing to remember is that if you were to temperature normalize them, in other words, if your current CPU is running at, let's say, 48 or 50 degrees delta T over ambient, so you're maybe in the 70s if your ambient temperature is about 20 or so, if you're in that range and you're okay with it, then you can buy something like a cheap tower cooler, this one or otherwise, and bring the fan speed down, and now you might be cutting your perceived noise level by multiples, whereas the temperature remains roughly the same. So our points of criticism for this cooler would be the pressure. We noticed that the NH-U12S in our original sample, despite, well, there's 2 of them that we've tested, but despite the bend in the orientation of the tower on this one, it still had decent pressure application. It was better pressure map than the Redux. So the Redux could have been better there. We think that comes down to more of a QC type of thing, or more likely a tolerances in manufacturing of the mounting kit. And additionally, we think the QC in general appears to need work. This is not the Redux, but it definitely, I mean, it all comes from the same places, so same problems, but that bend's just not acceptable, and it really shouldn't be like that. So this would indicate to us that there needs to be some better QC either in manufacturing or somewhere else in line, maybe in packaging even, because that should have been caught by packaging. A lot of that's still manual, and someone should have seen that. So that's an area that Noctua could improve on. Better than stock, we'll test some other coolers that are a bit cheaper than this, but similar in size, and see how it does versus those. Keep an eye out for that. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.